November 27, 1941. Gondar, Ethiopia, 7,000 feet above sea level. General Gugliel Manassi stood in his headquarters watching the final collapse. His garrison, once 40,000 strong, was down to fewer than 20,000 men. Ethiopian irregulars surrounded the town. British artillery hammered his positions, and climbing the mountain passes cutting through barbed wire under machine gun fire were African soldiers from Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, supported by West African artillery and Ethiopian irregulars. Troops that Italian intelligence had dismissed as poorly trained colonial auxiliaries. Troops that fascist propaganda claimed couldn't fight in mountains. Troops that were now destroying the last stronghold of Italy's East African Empire. By mid-afternoon, Nazi sent his final message to Rome. Enemy troops had penetrated the barbed wire entanglements. Armored vehicles had entered the town. His reserve brigade couldn't stop the attack. Italy's East African Empire, which had stretched across Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, covering nearly 1 million kilometers and ruling 5 million people, ceased to exist. The soldiers who ended it weren't British regulars. They were African riflemen of the King's African Rifles. Men who'd proven every Italian assumption wrong. And what Italian commanders witnessed in those final months would force them to write reports their superiors didn't want to read. By June 1940, Benito Mussolini's colonial empire in East Africa looked unassailable. Italy controlled Ethiopia, seized in 1935 through a brutal conquest involving mustard gas and aerial bombardment. They held Eritrea, colonized since 1890. Italian Somaliland completed the territory. Nearly 300,000 troops garrisoned these colonies, with approximately 91,000 Italian metropolitan soldiers and over 200,000 colonial equerry recruited from Eritrea and Somalia. The Ria Aeronautica operated 325 aircraft. Italian armored units fielded 244 tanks and armored cars. The Royal Navy couldn't penetrate the Red Sea in force. The Mediterranean fleet was tied down facing the Italian Navy. British forces in neighboring Sudan, Kenya, and British Somaliland numbered roughly 19,000 troops scattered across thousands of miles. Italian commanders in East Africa believed they held an impregnable position. General Amadeo de Savoor-Olst, Duke of Aosta and Viceroy of Italian East Africa, commanded from Addis Ababa. He was considered Italy's most competent colonial commander. Under him served General Gugliel Manassi, tasked with defending the northern approaches. General Petro Gizera held the southern sector. General Luigi Fusha commanded in Eritrea. These weren't incompetent officers. They were professionals who'd fought in the First World War and subsequent colonial campaigns. They had fortified mountain passes, stockpiled ammunition, and positioned their forces to defend every approach. The problem was supplies. Italy's East African Empire was surrounded. British forces held Sudan to the west, Kenya to the south, and British Somaliland, though briefly lost in August 1940 to the east. The Red Sea was contested. Naval resupply was dangerous and limited. The Duke of Aston knew his 300,000 troops couldn't be sustained indefinitely. But he believed they could hold long enough Axis victories in North Africa and the Mediterranean to force a negotiated settlement. The mountain terrain favored defense. Ethiopian irregulars, though numerous, lacked heavy weapons, and the British would need to commit massive resources to an offensive in terrain that killed logistics. What neither the Duke of Alcester nor his subordinate commanders anticipated was the quality of the forces Britain would deploy against them. Not British regular battalions which were needed in North Africa and Europe. Not Indian Army divisions, though some would participate. The backbone of the British offensive would be African soldiers recruited and trained in East Africa and West Africa, organized into formations that Italian intelligence consistently underestimated. The King's African Rifles expanded from a peacetime strength of 2,821 African soldiers in 1938 to over 20,000 by March 1940. The Royal West African Frontier Force drawing from Nigeria, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. South African motorized units and armored cars. Ethiopian irregular forces seeking to liberate their country. These forces faced immediate challenges. British Somaliland fell to Italian attack in August 1940. Forcing a humiliating evacuation. Italian forces pushed into Sudan and Kenya, capturing border posts and threatening deeper penetration. The Duke of Aosta had numerical superiority in the initiative. But he made a strategic decision that would prove fatal. He chose to consolidate his forces rather than exploit his advantage. He pulled back from Sudan. He didn't push deep into Kenya. He fortified mountain positions and waited. This gave Britain time to build up forces, establish supply lines, and plan a coordinated offensive from 3 directions simultaneously. In January 1941, the British counteroffensive began. Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, younger brother of Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanded the southern thrust from Kenya. Lieutenant General William Platt commanded the northern offensive from Sudan. Both commanders relied heavily on African troops. The 1st South African Division, 2nd South African Division, 11th African Division, and 12th African Division formed the main striking force. The King's African Rifles provided the infantry backbone. Nigerian, Gold Coast, and other West African battalions reinforced them. These weren't garrison troops given rifles and pushed forward. They were trained infantry formations with supporting arms, artillery, signals, engineers, and medical units. The King's African Rifles had been established in 1902. Originally formed from soldiers who'd served in the Imperial British East Africa Company's forces. By 1940, it comprised 6 battalions recruited from Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, Nyasaland, and Northern Rhodesia. Each battalion had approximately 150 African soldiers commanded by 36 British officers, a ratio of roughly 1 officer to every 30 men. The African soldiers received infantry training comparable to British regular army standards. Weapon handling, fieldcraft, minor tactics, and battle drills were drilled repeatedly. Pre-war veterans provided the experienced cadre when rapid expansion began in 1939. What made these units effective wasn't just training, it was motivation. African soldiers in the King's African Rifles were volunteers serving for pay, not conscripts. Many came from warrior traditions where military service brought prestige. They had no ideological commitment to fascism's defeat, but they had professional pride and unit cohesion. British officers who learned Swahili, respected local customs, and led from the front earned fierce loyalty. The contrast with Italian colonial forces would prove decisive. Italian askari were often poorly paid, sometimes going months without wages. Their Italian officers frequently treated them with contempt. When pressure mounted, this difference in morale would shatter Italian defenses. The first major test came at Keren in Eritrea, February to March 1941. Italian forces under General Nicolangelo Carnomio held mountain positions considered impregnable. The 4th Indian Division and 5th Indian Division attacked repeatedly, suffering heavy casualties. The Italians defending Keren fought magnificently. British official histories acknowledged this, noting that no enemy put up a finer fight than the Sivoa battalions at Keren. That the colonial troops fought with valor and resolution until they cracked at the very end. But crack they did. After weeks of attritional combat, the Indian divisions broke through in late March. Carnomio's forces collapsed. The road to Asara lay open. In the south, Cunningham's force advanced with shocking speed. The 11th African Division and 1st South African Division crossed from Kenya into Italian Somali land. Nigerian battalions of the Royal West African Frontier Force, part of the 11th African Division, covered 100 m in 3 days through terrain Italian planners believed impossible. At Juba River, they encountered Italian defensive positions. The Italians expected a pause for reconnaissance and artillery preparation. Instead, Nigerian troops launched an immediate assault, crossing the river under fire and storming the defensive works. The Italians broke and retreated. This pattern repeated across the southern front. Italian commanders planned phased withdrawals to prepared positions. African troops didn't give them time to consolidate. At Mada Pass, Nigerian soldiers climbed mountainsides that Italian intelligence reports claimed were unscalable. At Bablé, they advanced across open plains under machine gun and artillery fire, attempting to cut barbed wire with machetes when explosive charges failed. The speed of advance shocked Italian commanders. Forces they dismissed as second-rate colonial troops were out-marching, out-fighting, and out-maneuvering their garrisons. The breakthrough came in early April. Addis Ababa, capital of Ethiopia and seat of the Duke of Astas's administration, fell on April 6, 1941. The Duke retreated north to Amba Ali, a mountain fortress where Ethiopian forces had made their last stand against Italian conquest. In 1896, he had 15,000 troops, limited ammunition, and dwindling food supplies. British and Commonwealth forces surrounded him. The 2nd South African Division attacked from the south. The King's African Rifles battalions blocked escape routes. Artillery pounded the fortress daily. The Royal Air Force flew constant ground attack missions. If you're finding this deep dive interesting, consider subscribing. It supports the channel. The Duke of Worcester kept a diary during the siege. His entries documented the relentless pressure. April 29, 1941. Constant firing all day long. We spend the day jumping from one rock to another, barely to the ground with grenade splinters coming from all sides and volleys from the machine guns. Every 3 minutes, a plane dives on us, shooting with its front machine gun, then drops stick bombs. May 2nd, the situation is very grim. The feeling among the troops is low. May 10th, terrible bombing. The planes machine gunned us all day. By May 18th, his position was hopeless. He surrendered the next day, May 19th, with full military honors. 7,000 Italian troops and 3,000 colonial soldiers laid down their arms. But Italy's East African Empire didn't end at Amber Alagi. 2 major garrisons remained. General Petro Guidera held Jimma in the southwest with 20,000 troops. General Gugal Manassi commanded the Gondar garrison in the northwest. Initially 40,000 troops defending the mountainous terrain north of Lake Tana. Guidera surrendered in early July after negotiations. His troops were exhausted, supplies depleted, and escape impossible. That left Gondar. Nossi was the last Italian commander in East Africa, still holding territory. He was determined to resist. General Nari was considered by historian Angelo Del Bacia as the best officer of the Italian Royal Army in East Africa. He'd commanded the 2nd Eritrean Division during the Abyssinian War and earned a reputation for tactical competence and personal courage. At Gondar, he had significant advantages. The town sat at 7,000-foot elevation in the Ethiopian highlands. Mountain passes approaching Gondar required attackers to climb 4,000 feet escarpments. The terrain was brutal. Narrow defiles, steep slopes, and limited water sources. Nassi fortified every approach. He positioned artillery to cover the passes. He stockpiled ammunition and food. He believed he could hold for months, possibly into 1942. British command assigned the 12th African Division under Major General Charles Christopher Folkes to reduce Gondar. Folkes, nicknamed Fluffy, was a career officer who'd been highly critical of fascism throughout the 1930s. His division comprised 3 brigades, predominantly African soldiers. The 25th East African Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Ul James included the 2nd 3 Road, 2 ND 4TH and 3 Road 4TH battalions of the King's African Rifles. These were Kenyan, Ugandan and Tangan soldiers. The 25th East African Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Ul James included the 2nd 3 Road, 2 ND 4TH and 3 Road 4TH battalions of the King's African Rifles. These were Kenyan, Ugandan and Tangan soldiers. The 26th East African Infantry Brigade under Brigadier W.A. Demeline fielded the 2nd 2 ND, 4th 4TH and 1 ST 6THK battalions. Supporting units included the 51st Gold Coast Medium Battery, West African Artillery with 3.7 howitzers, the Kenya Armored Car Regiment with Marman Harrington Armored Cars, a South African Light Armored Detachment, Ethiopian Irregular Forces, and 1 British Regular Battalion, the 1st Battalion Argyll and Southern Thurland Highlanders. The siege began in May 1941 when Ethiopian irregulars surrounded Gondar's outlying positions. Notsi's garrison still numbered 40,000 troops at that point. But as months passed, his position deteriorated. Colonial soldiers deserted when pay stopped arriving. Food supplies dwindled. Ammunition was rationed. By September, his effective strength had dropped to approximately 7,000 Italian metropolitan soldiers and 12,000 colonial auxiliaries. Still, he held the mountain passes. The Wulchifitit Pass was defended by 4,000 troops under Colonel Mario Ganella. The Kulka Pass, critical to any assault on Gond itself, had strong fortifications and artillery positions. The 12th African Division faced a brutal problem. Frontal assaults on mountain passes meant climbing 4,000 feet under fire. Artillery support was limited by ammunition supply. Every gun, every shell had to be brought forward on terrible roads. Pack transport required hundreds of mules and donkeys. Water resupply was a constant nightmare. The African soldiers would be attacking uphill against prepared positions defended by troops who'd had months to fortify. It was the kind of operation that killed attackers by the thousands in the First World War. But the K battalions weren't First World War British conscripts. They were professional light infantry trained for exactly this kind of fighting. The Wulcha Pass attack began in September. The 2nd 4THK and 3rd 4THK led the assault. They climbed through the night to reach jumping-off positions. At dawn, they attacked. Italian artillery opened fire. Machine guns swept the slopes. The K soldiers advanced in short rushes, using terrain for cover. They worked their way up the escarpment over 3 days of continuous fighting. On September 28, Colonel Ganella surrendered. 950 Italian and colonial troops had been killed. 1,629 Italians and 1,450 Colonial soldiers became prisoners. The K battalions had suffered 200 casualties, but they'd taken the pass. The Kulka Pass was next, the last major obstacle before Gondar itself. Nossi concentrated his remaining reserves here. The 26th East African Brigade attacked on November 20th. The 2nd SEK moved along the western approach. The 4th climbed the eastern slopes. Artillery from the 51st Gold Coast medium battery pounded Italian positions. The Italians fought desperately. They knew Kulka's fall meant Gon's fall. For 48 hours, the battle raged across the mountain. African soldiers cleared Italian trenches with bayonets and grenades. On November 21st, the pass fell, but the victory came at a cost. Lieutenant Colonel Ohms MSBY, commander of Royal Artillery, was killed by the last Italian air attack in East Africa. On November 22, Sentente Yepi Met flew the Ria Aeronautica's final operational aircraft in East Africa, a single Fiat CR-42 biplane on a strafing run against British artillery positions at Kulka. He killed Lieutenant Colonel Ormsby in that attack, then landed at Gondar, destroyed his plane, and fought on his infantry. It was a gesture of defiance, but it changed nothing. Gondar was surrounded. The passes were taken. General Nari had perhaps 12,000 effective troops left. The 12th African Division was preparing the final assault. The attack began at 5:30 a.m. on November 27, 1941. The 26th East African Brigade attacked from the east. Each K battalion organized pack transport with 150 mules and donkeys to carry ammunition, water, and medical supplies. The 25th East African Brigade attacked from the south with artillery support. The Kenya Armored Car Regiment, equipped with Marman Harrington armored cars, mounting 2 pounder guns and machine guns, waited for the infantry to break through. Then they'd exploit into the town itself. Ethiopian irregulars sealed escape routes to prevent Italian forces from fleeing into the countryside. By midday, a Zo airfield on Gon's outskirts was captured. The 2nd 3-Road K cleared the runway perimeter. Italian defenders fell back into the town. By early afternoon, the 26th Brigade had reached the eastern suburbs. House-to-house fighting began. Italian troops attempted a counterattack from their barracks, but West African artillery fire broke it up. At 3:00 p.m., the Kenya Armored Car Regiment's lead vehicles penetrated the town center. Italian resistance collapsed sector by sector. By mid-afternoon, General Nassi sent his final message to Rome. His reserve brigade had been unable to stop the attack. Enemy troops had penetrated the barbed wire entanglements. Armored vehicles had entered the town. He surrendered. The 12th African Division captured approximately 22,000 prisoners at Gondar, 10,000 Italians, and 12,000 colonial troops. Total Commonwealth casualties for the entire East African campaign from January to November 1941 were approximately 5,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Italian and colonial losses exceeded 230,000 prisoners taken, plus tens of thousands killed and wounded. It was the most lopsided Allied victory of the Second World War's early years. 70,000 Commonwealth troops, the majority of them African soldiers, had defeated an Italian force that initially numbered 300,000. What Italian commanders witnessed forced many to write reports their superiors didn't want to read. A British brigadier commanding Nigerian troops wrote to General Alan Cunningham. Knowing Cunningham held a low opinion of African forces, the letter documented what Italian commanders had seen from the other side. It had been said that the Nigerian soldier could not go short of water. He has done so without a murmur. It had been said he could not fight well out of his native bush. At Mard Pass, he fought his way up mountainsides, which would be recognized as such even on the frontier. It has been said he would not stand up well to shelling and machine gun fire in the open. At Babil, under such fire, men were trying to cut down enemy wire with their machetes. It has been said that he would be adversely affected by high altitudes and cold. At Bidimo, after a freezing night on the hill, he advanced over the open plain at dawn with the same quiet, cheerful determination he seems always to carry about with him. He is magnificent. Italian prisoners captured during the campaign revealed their demoralization to Allied interrogators. One group told American volunteer John Hay, "Whenever you see an Italian over 40 years old, shoot him. Don't take him prisoner." When Hayes asked why, they responded, "Because they are responsible for all this. It's their war, not ours. We didn't want this war." The contrast between British African forces and Italian colonial troops was stark. K battalions maintained cohesion throughout the campaign despite hard fighting and heavy casualties. Italian Ascari units frequently deserted when officers couldn't pay them or when food supplies ran out. At Gondar, Notz's garrison shrank from 40,000 to fewer than 20,000, partly through desertion. This wasn't because Italian colonial soldiers were inherently inferior. British official histories acknowledged that properly led and supplied Italian Eritrea and Ascari were formidable opponents. The Sivoa battalions at Keren fought with extraordinary courage, but Italian colonial administration was corrupt and brutal. African soldiers under Italian command knew they were expendable. When the situation looked hopeless, they had no reason to die for officers who treated them with contempt. British African soldiers served under a different system. The King's African Rifles paid regularly, promoted on merit, and had British officers who often learned local languages and respected their men. That difference in leadership and morale decided battles. The Duke of Stir himself provided testimony about Commonwealth pressure during the Amba Alaji siege. His diary entries written as his fortress collapsed around him documented the relentless attacks. "I wish this diary had a soundtrack," he wrote on May 10. The constant dive bombing, machine gun fire, and artillery bombardment had worn down his troops psychologically. They weren't defeated by one dramatic assault. They were ground down by continuous pressure that never let up. Pressure applied by forces the Duke had initially dismissed as colonial auxiliaries. The strategic impact of the East African campaign extended far beyond Italy's colonial holdings. In April 1941, President Roosevelt reclassified the Red Sea, removing it from America's Neutrality Act combat zones. This opened a supply route to Egypt that would prove critical as the North African campaign intensified. British forces no longer needed to worry about Italian threats from East Africa. Troops and aircraft could be redeployed to more critical theaters. The Suez Canal was secure. And perhaps most importantly, the first Allied strategic victory of the Second World War had been won, boosting morale at a time when Britain was losing nearly everywhere else. The King's African Rifles received battle honors for the campaign in capital letters on their colors. Gondar, Kulkaba, and Badzo. Abyssinia 1940–1941 individual acts of heroism were recognized. Sergeant Nigel Gray Leakey of the 1st 6th posthumously received the Victoria Cross for attacking Italian tanks barehanded at Quito on May 19, 1941. He was the only K member awarded the VC during the East African campaign. His citation described how he rushed forward alone under heavy fire, climbed onto an Italian tank, and attempted to disable it with grenades before being killed. It was the kind of courage that Italian commanders witnessed repeatedly from African troops they'd been told was second-rate. Post-war, the East African campaign was largely forgotten. North Africa, Burma, and the European theater dominated public memory. The African soldiers, who'd won Britain's first strategic victory, received little recognition. Many returned to colonial territories where they were still denied basic rights despite their service. Veterans of the K participated in independence movements across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika using skills and confidence gained in military service. The 12th African Division was disbanded after the campaign. Its constituent battalions served in Burma, Ceylon, and Madagascar. Some KAAR soldiers fought through to 1945, ending the war in Southeast Asia, thousands of miles from their initial victories in East Africa. Italy's East African Empire lasted 17 months under British and Commonwealth assault, not 6 months as sometimes claimed. The timeline from Italy's entry into war on June 10, 1940, to Gondar surrender on November 27, 1941, spans 1 year, 5 months, and 17 days. The 6 months figure may derive from the active offensive phase January to May 1941 or the period from the Duke of Astor's surrender at Amba Alaji in May to Gon's fall in November, roughly 6 months. But the full campaign was longer and more complex than simplified narratives suggest. The cost to Italy was catastrophic. Approximately 230,000 Italian and colonial troops became prisoners. Equipment losses included 325 aircraft, 244 tanks and armored cars, thousands of trucks and artillery pieces, and massive stores of ammunition and supplies. The Ria Marina lost 8 destroyers, 5 submarines, and numerous auxiliary vessels in the Red Sea. More significant than material losses was the psychological impact. Italy's first colonial empire, seized with such brutality in the 1890s and 1930s, had been torn apart by forces fascist propaganda claimed were racially inferior. The propaganda couldn't explain how African troops had climbed mountains, endured artillery fire, and systematically destroyed every Italian defensive position from the Juba River to the Gondar highlands. German commanders took note, though they rarely said so publicly. The East African campaign demonstrated that colonial troops properly trained and led could defeat European armies. This was a lesson Germany would learn again in North Africa when the French brought African colonial divisions into combat. It was a lesson Japan would learn in Burma when African, Indian, and British troops stopped their advance and pushed them back. The myth of European military invincibility, already shaken by the First World War, was crumbling further. African soldiers were proving they could fight and win against supposedly superior opponents. What Italian commanders witnessed at Gondar, Kulkaba, Walter Fitt, Mard, and dozens of other engagements was simple. African soldiers trained to British standards, led by competent officers and properly supplied, were the equal of any infantry in the world. The British brigadier's assessment, "He is magnificent," stands as the campaign's verdict. Not from propaganda, not from distant observers, from a commander who'd watched his Nigerian soldiers perform the impossible, then felt compelled to document it for a superior officer who doubted them. That testimony, written in 1941, as the campaign ended, carries more weight than any modern analysis. It was the judgment of men who'd witnessed African soldiers under the worst conditions warfare could create. Conditions where training and courage were tested to destruction, and seen them excel. General Nazi surrendered Gondar on November 27, 1941. 10 days later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Second World War's scope exploded globally. East Africa became a forgotten theater almost immediately. But for the African soldiers who'd fought there, the experience was transformative. They defeated a European colonial power. They'd proven their competence in modern warfare, and they'd earned battle honors their regiments would carry for decades. When independence movements swept across Africa in the 1950s and 60s, many leaders were veterans of the K and Royal West African Frontier Force. The confidence and skills gained fighting in Ethiopia echoed through post-colonial Africa's political development. Italy's East African Empire seized through poison gas and aerial bombardment held for barely 5 years before African soldiers tore it down. The Duke of Aosta died in British captivity in 1942. His diary a testament to the relentless pressure that broke his forces. General Nari survived the war and returned to Italy. His reputation as a competent commander intact despite defeat. The Italian soldiers who'd fought under him went to prisoner of war camps in Kenya, South Africa, and India. Many didn't return home until 1946 or later. For them, the East African campaign was a disaster that shattered Mussolini's imperial dreams and revealed the hollowness of fascist racial theories. The King's African Rifles continued service until the 1960s, when African colonies achieved independence and formed their own national armies. The regimental traditions, battle honors, and standards passed to successor units in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Malawi. Veterans associations preserve the history. But in popular memory, particularly outside Africa, the East African campaign remains overshadowed by more famous theaters. The 70,000 Commonwealth troops, predominantly African, who defeated 300,000 Italian and colonial forces, deserve recognition equal to any Allied victory of the Second World War. November 27, 1941. Gondar, Ethiopia. General Nassi surrendered his garrison by mid-afternoon. African troops of the 12th Division occupied the town. Italian East Africa ceased to exist. The empire Mussolini proclaimed from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in 1936. The empire seized through chemical warfare and massacre had lasted 5 years and 11 months. The soldiers who ended it weren't the forces Italian commanders expected. They were Kenyan, Ugandan, and Tangan riflemen of the King's African Rifles, supported by West African artillery and Ethiopian patriots who'd climbed mountains Italian intelligence said were impossible endured conditions. Italian planners claimed African troops couldn't survive and fought with skill and courage that shattered every assumption. What Italian commanders witnessed was simple. African soldiers were magnificent. The battle honors on K regimental colors written in capital letters confirm what those commanders learned the hard way. Gondar, the last word of Italy's East African Empire, spoken by African troops who'd proven themselves the equal of any soldiers in the